All right, I just wanted to do a little test here, just like a little A/B. This is a very informal, little stupid video, but I'm just doing this just to make sure I'm not crazy. So I've got the Grace and the Trainwreck. This is Trainwreck clone, and I kind of want to show that I'm feeling more and more confident that this Grace is based on a Trainwreck. So this isn't a real Trainwreck. This is a Carolan Raw 35 Mark II, which is basically, supposedly one of the most accurate Trainwreck clones out there. They were built by the guy who runs Carolan just for friends of his. You had to have a Trainwreck in order for him to build you one, and it was so that you could gig with this and you didn't have to take your $40,000 amp like out into whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of show a couple of things on these two, and then we'll take it from there. You'll notice just right out of the box that the controls are extremely similar, right? They both have a bright switch. They both have just a volume, right? This explicitly says volume on the Grace, right? It doesn't say gain, it says volume, just like on a Trainwreck. Trainwrecks don't say gain, they say volume, right? And then it's treble, middle bass, treble, middle bass, right? And now this one does have a master, right? This one doesn't have a master. Real Trainwrecks are not master volume amps. And then a presence control, and the presence control is at the very end of the circuit, right? Just like, I mean, you can see the layout is like literally almost identical, right? Bright switch, bright switch. Now this one does have a boost switch that the guy from Carolan put on here for solos and for thicker sounds on single coils and stuff. It's like an added kind of feature, right? But it doesn't have a negative feedback, right? Like this one has a negative feedback on the back, right? So there are some differences, but they're very similar, right? They're the physical layout, right, is very similar. So I'm just going to do a little recording here. This is a Sir Classic S, nothing crazy, right? So let's test it out, and we'll see, you know, what the story is. I just want to see like how close they sound, and they're both coming out of this Carstens cabinet, right? So, you know, my initial feedback when I first, so loud, this amp. Non-master volume amps, you know, loud as fuck. So when I first played the Carolan, I played it through this V30 cab over here that I have, and I thought it sounded, you know, good, but not like, I was like, I don't know, the frequencies are a little off. And then when I plugged it into this cabinet, I was like, you know, I think it'll sound good with a more mellow cabinet. And so when I plugged it into this cabinet, I was like, wow, it sounds great. But then all of a sudden I was like, it sounds a lot like the Grace. And then that's kind of how I came up with this sort of idea, and I started paying attention to like how the amps were laid out and such. So anyways, I'll stop talking. So here's the Carolan. Here we go. What does that remind you of, right? It's just like the Grace. Look how clean it can be with so much gain, right? Like, right? So it feels and responds and such, frankly, just a lot like the Grace. That's like really all I can. You know, like I said, when I first started playing around with it, my first instinct was like, when I plugged it into this cabinet, it was like, it sounds like the Grace. It sounds like a more vintage version of the Grace, right? So I'm going to stop this video. I'll switch over to the actual Grace, and you know, you can hear. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so I'm back with the Grace now. So we're running the Grace. So I'm just going to play, and you tell me what you think. Sounds very fucking similar to me. I mean, it's very close. They sound, feel, and respond very similar. Now, I think there are some differences, right? This amp has way more gain on tap, right? I have the gain pretty low right now, right? Because this amp has way less gain. Like I said, this almost feels like a more vintage version of this, right? This is a more modern version of a Trainwreck, is what it sounds like to me. It's like a Trainwreck with more gain, a response knob right on the back, so you can change the negative feedback, right, and a master volume, right? And it's generally voiced, I think, a bit brighter with the bright cap on this might be more aggressive than the bright cap on this. I don't know. So without the bright cap, here's what it sounds like. If I turn the brake switch off, it'll get a lot darker, right? But here's like the neck pickup on 3, just for your, you know. This amp is a bit darker by nature than this one, but the bright cap, I think, on this one is more aggressive than the bright cap on this one. This one's a little more subtle. Yeah, it's definitely darker. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the treble back down and turn the bright cap back on, and let's see what that does. Okay, so I'm at 3 now again. Very similar to this. It's almost identical. I mean, really fucking close to me. Now, of course, the Grace has way more gain, right? So, like, if I were to turn this up to, like, you know, noon, for example, it's going to just really take off, right? I mean, you know, so I'll put it up to, like, I'll put it up to 10 again, because that was just a 10, right? So here's 10. They're very close. All right, I'm going to turn off the Grace and go back to the Trainwreck one more time, just to, you know, put it back in your ears, right? Okay, so stand by. All right, let's hear the Trainwreck again. Turn on the boost. Grace with the boost and the bright and the volume up. Now, one thing I do want to do real quick, I'm going to switch back to Grace for just 1 second, because I think actually they'll sound closer if I turn the response on the Grace down. Why? Because it'll make the amp more wild like this one. So like I'll pause 1 second and come right back and see if we can, do that. All right, we are back with the Grace. I turned the response knob all the way down on the back, right? So the least amount of negative feedback. Let's see what it sounds like. This amp, okay, so here's my final takeaways, and this will be it. I'll turn this off. My final takeaways are, I think these amps are very, very, very close. I'm not an amp engineer, right? I don't know anything about how amps are constructed, right? Like, I don't know, right? But what I'll tell you is, I think, having these and knowing what I know now, like, it seems very obvious to me that this is some kind of Trainwreck. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not trying to out Brian or anything like that, but it feels like this is some kind of Trainwreck, right? It's a more modern sounding Trainwreck with way more gain, and frankly, a much more responsive EQ section. I didn't do a lot of EQ tweaking, right, in this demo, but the controls on this amp are kind of like an old Plexi, where they really don't do all that much. Like, the EQ on this is kind of medium, right? Like, it works, but it's not the greatest, right? Like an old Plexi, right? Whether it's on 1 or 10, there's not a ton of difference. It's more about the amount of signal that's coming through, right? It's kind of similar with this amp. This amp, the EQ, is much more responsive, right? So I think that's the difference, right? I guess the takeaways are, these are very similar. They're extremely similar. This one obviously is more modern. It has a negative feedback option, which this one does not, so you can fuck around with it. It has a master volume, which this one does not, right? This one, the EQ is much more responsive than this one. So like I said, I think this is obviously a Trainwreck, right? This is known that the Carol Ann is a Trainwreck. This Raw 35 Mark II is a Trainwreck, right? Literally it is, right? It's not a clone in the circuit sense, but it's a clone in the sonic sense. That's what the guy from Carol Ann said. He said, I didn't try and replicate the parts and I replicated the sound, right? And the feel. And so this is a pretty accurate Trainwreck Express clone, right? And then this to me feels like this, but just a more modern, higher gain, more versatile version of this, right? That's I guess my kind of final takeaway, right? So like I said, I don't design amps. I just listen, right? I listen and I play. And one thing I can't convey in this video is the feel. And that's one of the things that I really kind of hate about YouTube, to be honest with you, is that, like, I can't convey to you the feel under the fingers, right? But the feel between these two is very, very, very similar. The way the amps respond is extremely similar. If you notice, when I was doing that part where I was kind of doing like I don't have the amp turned on, but when I was doing like the, right, in that riff, right? That's a part where you really got to feel it. You've got to feel this string bouncing, and you've got to feel the up pick of this, so it's like, it's really a feel-based riff, right? As opposed to like, which is just more about playing those chords as big sounding as you can. Like, this riff is really about feel. And the feel on that riff between these two is almost identical. It's almost identical. This one, like I said, does feel more vintage, right? This is like a more vintage version of the Grace. So maybe there's a world in which you're like, hey, I like the sound of the Grace, but it seems like it's too much of a flamethrower for me. Maybe you should consider a Trainwreck clone, right? I mean, you might really like it, right? Both of these amps are just that kind of like very spitty, you know, exploding kind of sound. And I don't know, Cliff from Axe Effects, right, said that the thing that makes a Trainwreck sound the way it does is the output transformer. It's apparently like overwound or something. It's like it's got more winds or something. I don't know all the details, right? So I would be interested to know if the same thing is true of the Grace, because Brian said something about like that these are custom mercury magnetic transformers that that he had made just for this amp. So it leads me to believe that maybe, he took a page out of Ken Fisher's book and used one of those really overwound transformers to get it to do what it does. But these two amps, just no amp responds like the Grace in terms of the volume knob until I met this amp, right? Like every other amp I have, sure, they change with the volume knob, etc., but not the way the Grace does, right? And as soon as I plugged into the Carol Ann, that's what tipped me off, was the way that the volume knob responded. And I was like, that's when I was like, I feel like this is a train wreck, right? The Grace is a train wreck because no other amp responds with the volume knob the way that train wrecks do, apparently. So I just wanted to make this, again, I'm not trying to out anybody. I'm not trying to say Brian ripped anything off. I want to be very clear. That's not what I'm saying. I don't know if they're actually circuit related or not, right? Like Brian could say, hey, they're not the same at all, right? I don't know. I'm just telling you they sound and respond and feel with the volume knob and the feel under your fingers. It's extremely similar. Extremely similar. So I would be very surprised if these amps didn't have a lot in common under the hood. So that's it. Yeah, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars doing a little informal iPhone video here for you today. And thanks, guys. Like and subscribe.